So today we are in Luke's Gospel. We're looking at Luke's version of the entry into Jerusalem. It is in the 19th chapter, and we're going to be looking at verses 28 through 40. Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem. After he had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. When he had come near Bethphage and Bethany, at the place called the Mount of Olives, he sent two of the disciples, saying, "Go into the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find tied there a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' just say this, 'The Lord needs it.'" So those who were sent departed and found it as he had told them. As they were untying the colt, its owners asked them, "Why are you untying the colt?" They said, "The Lord needs it." Then they brought it to Jesus, and after throwing their cloaks on the colt, they set Jesus on it. As he rode along, people kept spreading their cloaks on the road. As he was now approaching the path down from the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to praise God joyfully with a loud voice for all the deeds of power that they had seen, saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven." Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, order your disciples to stop." He answered, "I tell you, if these were silent, the stones would shout out." And we're going to go look through this and unpack it a little bit, and then we're going to spend most of our time on the last verse. It's important that we all, I hope we all know, and I'm pretty sure that on other Palm Sundays I've preached into this, it's important that we know that on this, at this time, and very likely on this same day, that you have counter processions going on, that you have Jesus riding in on this donkey, on this young colt, coming in from the east gate into Jerusalem. And it's a procession of peasants and people on foot. And it's a procession of the power and the peace and the love of God. And more than likely could have nearly been at the same time, may have actually been at the same hour. This seems to be an orchestrated thing by Jesus, with a line arranging for this donkey to be available for him. And in Luke's gospel, some of the other synoptics, Jesus really is only in Jerusalem once. But in Luke's gospel, we know that Jesus has been to Jerusalem many times. He went there every year for Passover as a child, and we have no reason to think that he didn't continue that. So Jesus has connections here in Jerusalem. So likely he's orchestrated this whole thing. So I wouldn't be surprised. It's speculation, and my wife hates it when I speculate, but it's speculation. But it's possible that it was the exact same time that Pontius Pilate is riding in from the west with a full Roman, the legion of Roman soldiers coming in with all the grandeur and regalness of the Roman Empire. And the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, is riding in from the west, and the peace of God is riding in from the east. And of course, the difference there is that the Romans kept peace by force. If you were a problem, they got rid of you. So there's a great difference in these two counter processions that more than likely were happening very close to the same time. Because Pilate is coming in for Passover. He's bringing additional troops there to keep control over Jerusalem during this volatile time. So we have that going on, and Jesus is riding in, and he's coming in from the Mount of Olives, and we have the Pharisees that come to him, and they ask for him to tell the people to be quiet. These people are making a lot of noise, and of course the problem there is the Pax Romana, isn't it? It's the peace of Rome. Where one has to believe that the Pharisees are very much afraid that if there's too much of a disturbance, the Romans are going to come and deal with it. And the Romans deal with things very effectively. The Romans were very efficient at keeping peace. That's why the Roman Empire lasted as long as it did. It wasn't until they became ineffective at it that the empire fell apart. they began hiring mercenaries instead of doing the work themselves, and that's a long story and a history lesson. But this is more than likely why the Pharisees, it's not necessarily because they are against Jesus, though they may well be, but they're afraid of what's going to happen. And so Jesus answers with that puzzling last verse, verse 40. I tell you, if these are silent, the stones would shout out. And we read that today, and we're inclined to think that what they're getting at is that Jesus is so powerful that even an inanimate object will find its voice and cry out for the glory of God and the power of Christ. And that's the imagery that I think that many of us come to that verse with. Is that wrong? Am I wrong, perhaps? But today we read that and we think, that's how strong, powerful God is. Even inanimate objects recognize God as supreme and proclaim the superiority or the divinity of Christ. But that's not what he's saying. Not at all. Stones are interesting things. And I've used this stone as an illustration before. But Brenda knows that's in my office, in my bookshelf. That stone. And why does Pastor have a rock on his bookshelf? Why does Pastor keep that rock close to him? Well, that rock is special. That rock came from the wall in the cheese factory that my great-grandfather had in Wisconsin. Which, if you're a cheese lover, that stone should be important to you because that's one of the very first cheese factories in Wisconsin. It's one of the oldest of all. They made Limburger cheese, and when you're this close to it, you can still maybe smell it on the stone. It's important to me because it's a connection. It has a history. There's meaning embedded in that stone. Now, I have other stones from the cheese factory that we have at our house, and we have a piece of timber from that building as well, because the building is falling down now. But it's amazing that it partially stands. So stones can have meaning. And if you don't believe that, look no further than the local cemetery. There's stones in that cemetery. And those stones have meanings and memories that are held within them. Meaning and memories that we've imbued upon those stones. And when I've done funerals around here, Keith Lampy has told me about some of these stones are soldiers from the Civil War. And that's how old the cemetery is. And we look at that in awe of that connection to the past that we have all the way back to the Civil War, which seems so distant to us. And for me, my great-grandfather, the stone that I have connected with great-grandfather, back home in Reliance is the cemetery, and there's stones there where my father and my grandparents and my great-grandfather and grandmother are on my mother's side, and actually my great-great-grandfather and great-great-grandmother on my mother's side all are residing in that plot of land back home. And though it's not a stone, just a distance away, there are the buttes. And those buttes have meaning because I know that's home for me. And I know that all of those bodies of all those people that were my heritage lie under the shadow of that butte, if the sun's low enough in the sky. And I know that someday, as long as Gail puts me there, I too will lie in that ground, there with my family. And thus those stones have great power. There are cemeteries in the Holy Land as well. And the thing that you may not realize is that as Jesus is riding down from the Mount of Olives, he passes the cemetery. He passes the largest and the oldest cemetery in Jerusalem. That cemetery has been there for 3,000 years. At the time of Jesus, it was already ancient. It was already over 1,000 years that his fathers and forefathers the saints were buried there. The followers of God, the followers of Judaism, and those stones were filled with memories. Those stones are filled with those obedient souls that follow the Word of God. And so when Jesus speaks in verse 40, and I'll back up just a little bit and say that I skipped over, there's a lot of, in the Old Testament, there's a lot of times where stones have meaning. And I'll only give you one, and that's in Genesis chapter 31, where Laban and Jacob erect a stone monument to settle their differences. And they call it Gilead, which means heap and witness. Those stones witness that covenant. All those stones in those cemeteries, and especially in this case, this cemetery outside the Mount of Olives, this is the place that has witnessed all of these things that have gone on as these people have served and worked and done the will of God. And so as Jesus is walking in that gate, or riding rather in that gate, and he says, I tell you, if these were silent, if these people here, if I could suddenly get these people to be quiet about me coming in as the Messiah, those stones over there, imbued with all those memories, all that millennium. At that time, it was up over 1,000 years old already. And we think Civil War cemetery headstone is old. 1,000 years where the souls are buried in that cemetery. 3,000 years now. Those stones would cry out and recognize me as the Messiah. There's another part of this story. To this day, faithful Jewish people want to be buried in that cemetery. That cemetery that is 3,000 years old. Hard to think you could find a plot there, isn't it? Because it's believed that when the Messiah comes and the resurrection comes, that's where it starts, in that cemetery. That cemetery that Jesus has just rode by. That's where the resurrection, the general resurrection, is to begin. It's powerful when we realize that. We read that verse and we think inanimate stones are going to talk. It's a lot more than that. That's the general resurrection. And in Matthew's gospel, which is the most Jewish of the Gospels, he goes even farther, doesn't he? And guess when he talks in verses 52 and 53 in the 27th chapter of Matthew, he says, And the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the graves after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. Guess where those saints that Matthew's writing about are coming from? They're coming from that cemetery. Jesus just walked by and said, those stones will cry out. In fact, they do cry out. Whether we take that story as a metaphor or we take that story as Matthew writing to a Jewish audience that would understand what he's talking about, doesn't matter. The meaning is the same. Those memories, those people that have gone on before, those stones imbued with all of that worship and celebration of the love and the grace and the glory and forgiveness of God, those stones will cry out. We too are stones. We carry memories, each and every one of us. Each and every one of us needs to remember those things. Each and every one of us needs to, just as that tombstone is there, that shares a little bit with us, so it's limited in what it can portray, it shares. We need to share. In 1 Peter, in chapter 2, verses 1 through 6, the living stone and a chosen people is the heading. Rid yourself, therefore, of all malice and all guile, insincerity, envy, and all slander. Like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow into salvation, if If indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good, come to him, a living stone. Though rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight, and like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For it stands in Scripture, see, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone, chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. We're all a part of that new temple. We're one stone among many in the body of Christ, and Christ is the temple. Let us remember to be a living stone. Let us remember to share those memories. Let us remember to proclaim, to shout out. Even though we may feel sometimes like an inanimate object, let us shout out, praise be to God, the Messiah has come. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so very much for the message of the triumphant entry. Lord, we thank you for the depth of the meaning of this passage, with all of the fulfillment of Scripture, the fulfillment of Zechariah chapter 9, with riding in on the donkey, Lord. But Lord, we also thank you for the depth and the understanding of the memories and the stones in the cemetery that Jesus just rode by. Lift these prayers to you today in your love and your glory.